had a lot of trouble with static electricity this morning. I was brushing this and it kept going. It's Marx. Karl Marx. Be careful. It's the one philosopher I don't really want to look like, but you know, that happens.
I don't know, he's got a pretty glorious beard.
That could be scary sometimes, though. So, looking at Karl Marx today, be our main interest, and that, along with communism. It's interesting, though, Marx is thought of as the inventor of communism, I think, in the common parlance, but he isn't, actually. He was invited by the communists, along with Engels, to co-author a tract of some sort to promote communism, and he wrote the Communist Manifesto. He and Engels, his friend Engels, wrote the Communist Manifesto for the committee. So, yes, he's associated with communism, wouldn't necessarily be thought of as the inventor of communism. There was already a communist party that he became a member of, right? So it's a little bit different. But he was a sponsor of it, became the head of the International Workers' Men, IWMA, whatever A stands for, agency or whatever, association, his association. And he was a head of that for its whole life until Buchanan, a competitor, Buchanan, caused a great deal of controversy, and then he basically broke that up. And meanwhile, moved to London. He ended up being ousted from lots of places because of his liberal political views. He initially goes to Bonn to study law, but he was fooling around too much, especially in writing letters and things to his girlfriend, Jenny. So Dad comes in and says, go to Berlin, study there instead. And the idea that would cut down the frivolity that he was engaged in at Bonn. And so he headed off to Berlin, where soon he ended up studying philosophy instead of law, influenced by Feuerbach and others. And he was a very good student there, ended up, as I mentioned, in a couple of classes earlier, studied some of the philosophy he studied was under Friedrich Schelling, and at about the same time as Kierkegaard. So you get the interesting juxtaposition of Kierkegaard, who basically rebels against the philosophical system of Hegel and focuses on the individual, the individual's free, the individual has to choose for himself, and basically we end up with existentialism from that. Marx, in virtually the same environment, rebels against the Hegelian system as well. And there were groups associated with Hegelian philosophy. The one were the old Hegelians, who had the oddest view that Hegel's system was the absolute, that Christianity was the absolute, the Prussian state was the absolute. And so basically, in a sense, history had ended. Ridiculous. And the young Hegelians, which Marx was a member of, rebelled against that and considered, I think correctly, what Hegel intended was that the dialectical process keeps on going. It doesn't reach the climactic end. It actually is a constant back and forth, dialectically in your own mind, in our mind, in the assembly's mind and the state's mind, etc. There's no point at which things just settle down and no longer happen. You just keep getting this dialectical process. It's the nature of things, right? And so, for the young Hegelians, there was going to be a antithesis to the thesis of the state as it was. And so they looked for it and criticized the state, trying to find what things are wrong with it that need to be improved. Well, of course, that was an autocratic state at the time, and people didn't like criticism. And so Marx, being one of the most outrageous of those, got kicked out. He first went on to get his PhD at Jena, University of Jena, Bonn, Jena, Berlin. Got his PhD. Is only, I think, 23 years old at the time. And because of his views, they didn't let him get a university position. He wanted to teach philosophy in a university, and they wouldn't allow it because of his liberal views. But so he ended up becoming an editor of a Zeitung, a newspaper, and that did well. But he was so outrageously liberal, especially in one article where he wrote about the poverty of the winemakers in Moselle. And so Germany kicked him out. He had to leave. He goes to Paris, got another job there with a new newspaper there that he thought, I'm all set. And so he married Jenny and then got fired because that whole magazine got destroyed because of its liberal views as well. And so he ended up going to London. Well, first Belgium for a while, but then he ended up in London, which was good because that's where Engels was, actually. And so he ended up becoming friends with Engels, and Engels was wealthy enough that basically the rest of Marx's life, he's supported by his friend Engels. He also ends up writing for the New York Tribune, by the way, and he made some money from them. So that's kind of fun that he wrote in English for an American newspaper. But in any case, his associations were with those who were fighting against the status quo for workers because he wanted to improve the lives of the working people. Remember when we were talking about Mill, this is a state of affairs that's really a problem for all of the more moral individuals that are concerned about others. And you're looking at Charles Dickens writing about the conditions, and John Stuart Mill even passing a law in Parliament to try to help the poor. They're very frustrated, though, because nothing seems to help. That's kind of like here, although we're not really in such a bad situation. I mean, I think if you compare American societies, for example, in Seattle and Tacoma and San Francisco, I don't know if you've been to any of these places, but my goodness, the homeless situation, the crisis among a lot of people, it's just terrible in some of those places. New York City, I haven't been to New York City since I was a kid, but interesting experience right here, though. Yesterday, we went to Tidal Wave to drop off some cookbooks, trying to make space. We either have to make space in our house or we have to move to a bigger house. It's like, because we're at that point in our lives, Swedish death cleaning, essentially. You gotta clean things up just to be able to move around. But as we left Tideway, we turned right on the street, that takes you over to Benson. And there was a gentleman, I suppose, sleeping. It was under a blanket, but his leg looked like a gentleman's leg. And he's sleeping with his leg bare, but his head covered with a blue blanket up against the wall. I think, what makes a person sleep on a pavement in this kind of, wasn't that warm a day, nor was that a very sane spot to sleep. Meanwhile, in the little median, which is at that point this wide, bricks, and some bricks there, was a bag. And I was thinking, I bet that's his bag, that he left over there. But as we pulled right up next to the bag, I looked at the curled up bag and discovered that there was a face to the bag. Not a bag, it was a person sleeping inches from traffic on both sides. What would you do in that situation? Any ideas? Numbers to call? Stop the car in traffic? What would you do? What I did was horrified and turned left and continued down Benson. Thinking about what should I have done? Should we have called somebody? Keep in mind that just the other day we had a young man drive over someone. There were two cars, have you read about? There were two cars that had stopped and were alarmed because there was somebody lying asleep, apparently, in the street. In fact, there was a camera that caught his behavior. Prior to that, he apparently was stumbling into the street, dropped a soda bottle, reached over to pick up the soda bottle, a Coca-Cola bottle, apparently, and then fell and just lay there. Well, two cars came up and they both stopped and realized, hey, this is a human being lying in the street. So they stopped, had their lights on, and got out, and they were talking and called the police to come. But meanwhile, a young man drove up behind them, drove around them, and then sped across right over the person that was lying in the street. Killed him probably just about instantly. And left. And so he's been arrested now, and of course the charges against him, as you can imagine, are hit and run. That's the main one, right? He himself thought he had run over a car park. He apparently thought that those two individuals had had an accident and that what he hit was a car part that had fallen off one of their cars or something. He realized, he says, that it was a human. You seen people sleeping and just living in town? Why are they doing this? I'm trying to get something started here. I'm not sure it's going to work. It's uncomfortable. Karl Marx, of course, sees all kinds of things that are uncomfortable. This is, let me see if I can find this. This is really well done.
This is the 19th century, a pivotal, tumultuous age that witnessed revolutions in industry, technology, and politics. But
also crucially in ideas, big, bold, dangerous ideas that would bring the world as we know it kicking and screaming into being.
Three great thinkers led the way: Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. They lived in a time when old certainties were breaking down, regimes were overthrown by mass uprisings, science was undermining religious authority. Their challenge was to figure out what makes us human in a fast evolving world.
Emigres, recluses, enemies of the state, these outsiders challenge the existential crisis of their age head on.
She's really good, but that's not the specific one I was looking for.